Hi, my name is Pappy Bedard. I'm a retired engineer and a Cinema 4D hobbyist. I don't really have a job with this stuff. I just have fun with it. And one of the things I was playing around with was see if I could make a simulation of blowing bubbles turning into different shapes. So I came up with a video and posted it on YouTube, on Facebook, and I got some comments and some requests for a tutorial. So this is what I did. I made this tutorial. What I'm showing here should be compatible with version 20 and up, because I did use a field at one point and the fields weren't available until R20. It could be maybe before R20, but you'd have to leave out the part that has fields. So here I am in Cinema 4D release 23, and I've already created a new project and I've saved it as Bubbles Tutorial. So let's start by creating a cube, and I'm going to turn display on to show lines, and I'm going to turn on the fillet, change that to 12, and in the segments I'll select all of these and change that to 17, control enter to change all three. So that's a nice distribution of points. Now we will grab the Spherify and put that under the cube. And I'm going to show the top view here and display it as wireframe so we can get a sense of what that's going to look like. So with strength 0, well, it fills these 4 squares. Strength 100, I want to shrink this radius so it stays about the same size. So the radius will be 100. So it'll transition from sphere to cube with the same overall size. Next, I will put a melt deformer in there, and I'll put that underneath Spherify, and let's see what it looks like at full strength. Well, that's way too big. I want it to stay around the same size, so I will change the melted size down to 100%. That's still too big, so I am going to go to Spherify and change the radius down to, well, let's see, about 55. I'm going to set a keyframe on that radius at time 0, and then at time 60, which is 2 seconds later, our melt is going to go down to 0. I'm going to set a keyframe there, and go back to 0 and change melt at 0 to 100. So let's see, as I go up to 60, yeah, it gets too small. So on Spherify, which I've already set a radius at 55 at frame 0, I'll set this back to 100 and set a keyframe there. And let's just see what it looks like halfway between. Yeah, it gets a little too big. So at frame 30, I'll shrink this down to 60.5. Set a keyframe there. Now let me just scrub through this between 0 and 60. Yeah, it stays right about the same size you can see in this top view. Go back to this view and let's take a look at this. Maybe it gets a little bit too pointy. So I'm going to the melt, back to the melt, and change the radius. Let's say to 400. So now I'll scrub this again and see. Okay. So that doesn't look like a bubble yet, but what we're going to do is start moving this out and changing where the melt deformer is located. But before I do that, I'm going to rearrange this a bit. One way you can apply deformers is to stack them up underneath an object, but another way is to create a null object, put your deformed object under that, and stack the deformers above it. So this will have exactly the same effect, as you can see. But this will have an advantage that later on we can replace that cube with some other object and everything else will still work. So clicking up on the null, I'm going to, let's go back to frame 0. Let's change the, let's see, the pitch. No, let's change the banking to 90 degrees. And we're going to go ahead and add a disk and make that positive X. So that's going to represent the hoop that we blow the bubbles from. So as we scrub through here, you can see that it'll look like it's coming out of that plane of soap. So let's see. So maybe around, well, let's say frame 45, we're going to start moving this bubble outwards. So at frame 45 on the null, I'll set the X coordinate to 0 and set a keyframe. And then maybe 100 frames later, so 145, we'll make it 500. Set a keyframe there. Readjust my view a little bit. So now if I play this, you'll see it blows up the bubble and then continues on. But obviously, what's wrong here is that the melt deformer is following the null. And I don't want that to happen. I want the melt to stay right where this plane is. So the way I can do that is, well, I already know that the null goes from x0 at 45 to x500 at 145. So I just need to make this kind of the opposite. So at 45, I want melt to be 0 in the y, and at 145, I want it to be minus 500 in the y. So I can show you that in the, let's see, if I go into the window timeline F curve and just look at the null X and the melt Y and frame all, you can see that they're the exact opposites. So the melt will always stay at 0. So what's cool about that now is that you can see that as it moves out, it will stay clipped right at that plane. Okay. So next we want this to slowly transition from this bubble, this sphere-shaped bubble, to the cube that we created. So we're going to slowly diminish the Spherify effect. So let's start that around, let's see, maybe frame 72, and we'll set the Spherify strength to 100, and then maybe at that 145, we will set it to 0 and set another keyframe. So let's play that through. So it slowly transitions to a cube. It's stays a little too straight. I'd like that cube to sort of drift around. So I'm going to rotate this null. So going back to 72, I will set the null coordinates. I'm going to leave the bank to 90, but I'll change the heading and the pitch. So we'll make them 0 here. But at 145, let's see what we can do here. So maybe set this down to 114, minus 114, and yeah, maybe 80. Yeah, so we'll have it end up here. So we'll set those 2 keyframes. Now scrub through this so it slowly turns and turns into a cube. But this looks a bit too rigid to be a bubble, so in order to give it that less rigid look, we're going to apply a Displacer deformer with a shader. So with null selected, let's see, I will go into Displacer deformer. I'm going to hold down Shift to put it underneath, but I will put that underneath melt. And over on the shading, I will choose noise. Now that's a bit too rough, so what I'll do is I'll go in here and I'll change the global scale to say 1000, maybe 800. And then what we'll do is add some animation. So we'll have it, the animation speed will be 1 per second. And let's give this a slightly bigger timeline. So let's go to 240. And I'm just going to hit play from here. So now you can see it kind of wobbles like a bubble. Okay. Finally, what we're going to do is make it make the bubble pop. So let's start the popping at around 210. And the way we're going to do this is to apply an effector. There's one called Poly FX, which allows us to modify all the polygons. I'm going to put that below the displacer. And right now it seems to have no effect because what we need to do is give an effector. So we'll add a plane effector. Now that definitely affected the polygons, but it's not quite the way we want. So in the plane effector parameters, we're going to turn off position and turn on scale, make it uniform scale and -1. That makes them all disappear. Now, how can we control them disappearing? Well, clicking on the poly effects object, we can then go to the fall off tab and add a, let's say, a linear field. And let's see, what do we have here? Let me check the coordinates of these things. I'm going to zero out this and zero out the linear field. All right, that's already 0. But you can see what happens when we change the linear field. It makes those polygons disappear. So I'm going to adjust this a little bit. So on the linear field, we'll make the heading -45 and the bank -45. So now if we can control this, you can see that the bubble will kind of unwrap. It's kind of the way a bubble bursts. It just doesn't disappear. It sort of unwraps. But what would be nice is at this edge that maybe we could have it curl up a little bit. So going back to the plane effector parameter, we're going to add a position, but we'll zero out the Y, and we'll just give it enough Z to make it look like it's kind of unwrapping. Yeah, so maybe about there. Well, let's see how we So yeah, so it looks like it's kind of unwrapping until it disappears. So right at 210, which is where the timeline is now at 210, I'm going to set the linear field coordinates and click on the P for position to select them all, and then click on any of these. That sets that keyframe. And then let's say maybe 10 frames later at 220, we want it to be right there. So we'll set that keyframe. So now if I scrub through this, you'll see that it'll disappear pretty quickly. If I hit play, bang, it's gone. So let's watch the whole thing. A bubble turns into a cube, slowly turns, and it pops. So there's a couple more things we could do to wrap this up. One is that when it pops, we want some droplets of water to fall. So the way we're going to do that is with a cloner. So I'll add a cloner, and we'll make a sphere to represent a drop of water. And we'll put the sphere under the cloner, and we're going to make the sphere really small, maybe 2 centimeters. And for the cloner, we want to create a object clone. So it's going to take points off of an object, and the object we want to refer to is the cube. So you could see there's some there. So let's go to about 100 drops. All right, so that might be enough. And then finally, we want those drops to fall. So on the cloner, we'll right-click and add a simulation tag, rigid body, and apply tag to children. But we don't want that clone to create those raindrops until it pops at 210. So at 210 on the cloner basic tab, we will set enabled a keyframe. We'll go back one single frame to 209 and disable it and set another keyframe. So if I just scrub through here, you could see that the water droplets will fall right as it pops. Play it again. Okay. And maybe one other thing we need to do. We take a look at this disk. It's just a flat thing. I kind of want to make it look more like it's soap. So and let's create a ring around it. So we'll create a Taurus, and we'll set that to point in the X direction. Maybe make the pipe radius 9. That looks good. And let's see if we play this. Okay, one thing I'd like to change is the displacer on the cube. I'm going to make the intensity maybe half as much, so it won't bulge out so much when it's there. Okay, so just to get that out of the way for now, I'm going to turn off the null objects so we can concentrate on this. First of all, I need to add a few more segments into the disk. So let's see, maybe about like that and like that. So now there's plenty of segments to use for the deformer, and we're going to use a displacer deformer on this one also. So shift click, and then the shading is going to be noise. For this one, let's pick a different noise. Let's say dense. Obviously that's way too intense, so let's increase that global scale. Let's try 500. Okay, but it's way too extreme. So we go up one level. Let's see, click on Displacer Object and shrink this down maybe to 3. But I want to automate this, animate it, but not in the same way I did the cube. This one, I want it to appear that this soap is drifting downwards. So go back into shading, and I'm going to leave animation speed at 0, but in movement, I'm going to make it 1%, and then, well, let's see, I'll try 1 centimeter and see how fast that looks. That's a little too fast. Let's make that 0.3 in the Y. So now it looks like it's soap and it's slowly drifting downwards. Let's turn back on the null. And let's check out the full animation now. Turns to a sphere, and then a cube, and then it drifts, and then it blows apart. So that is basically it for how I did this animation, other than the materials, which I'm really not going to cover because there's so many different ways, so many different render engines that people use, and each one has their own way of creating bubbles and lighting and everything else. So I'll let you do that research for yourself. But the final thing I want to do is to show you how I've used this to make bubbles not just in the shape of a cube, but in any shape. So let's pick a different shape. How about a torus? Let's make it a little bit smaller. Maybe a slightly less pipe radius. And we're going to drag that underneath cube. And we're going to drag cube out of that null parent and turn it off. So now Taurus should behave the same way. Let's see what happens. Whoa, it's way off. So let's see what happens here. Let me look at Taurus. I'm going to look at the coordinates. I'm going to reset all these to 0, including the angles. And I'll just slowly scrub through this. So as it comes out, oh, it looks like a ring, not a bubble. Well, that's because of the way this Spherify object works. What it does, it radiates a point from the center of the sphere out towards all the points on the object, and it moves those points to a sphere. Well, in the case of a torus, if the center of the Spherify object is in the center of the torus, in some directions there are no points that it can see. So what we need to do is take this torus and move it so that some of its points surround the point in the middle of the Spherify object. So let's continue from there and see how this unfolds. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And then this should also break apart. Now, it's a little too rough because I don't have enough segments on the torus. So let's fix that by maybe adding a few more ring segments and a few more pipe segments so that that tearing looks a little cooler. Now also the cloner right now is referencing the cube as its object. We can change that to the torus by dragging that in. And let's see if that's going to work. Yeah, so that should work. So let's play that one through. And let's try one other object. So let's say I go into the content browser, and let's see, how about sculpting base models? How about this female bust? Now that came in really small, so what I will do is scale that up so it's about the same size as that ring, and move it down, and then go back to my objects manager and drag that here under the Taurus, drag the Taurus out, uncheck it. Let's scrub through this and see what happens. Okay, but I don't like the way that ends up. So what I will do on the female bust is go to the rotation tool, rotate this around, rotate this around, and then move that roughly in the middle there. Now let's go scrub backwards and see what happens. Yeah, so it's kind of difficult to see if that's going to look like a nice spherical object with the lines on. So I'll turn the lines off. And yeah, that probably will render just fine. It slowly converts into the female bust. And it's got that little bit of a wobble from the Displacer Deformer. And then finally, it rips apart. And again, what we need to do is go to the cloner. And this time the female bust will be the object. And as I single step through, turns to rain. So maybe another thing I could do here is in the cloner, with the cloner selected, I could do a random effector. And for the parameters, we'll do no position, but we'll make the scale uniform scale, just so we have different size drops. Maybe make that about 0.42. That looks good. So that about wraps things up for this tutorial. Obviously, what I did next was to apply materials and an environment and lighting and rendered it out. What I did is I rendered each of these separate bubble shapes out individually as separate videos, and then I stitched them all together in an After Effects project and added a little popping sound when the bubbles burst. Actually, in the video I posted, I used X particles instead of a cloner to represent the drops of water falling, because I could have them blast out a little bit. It looked a little cooler. Anyways, so I hope you were able to pick up a couple of tips in this tutorial. And what I'm going to do is make the project file for that I just did here for the tutorial available for download for free on my Gumroad account. So you can download it and play around with it. Should be compatible with R20 and up, because I did use fields, and fields are not available and were not available until R20. Anyways, with that, thanks a lot, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.